Hi, I'm Matt Stoller, author of Monopoly-focused newsletter Big and an antitrust policy analyst. For today's Big Breakdown, I want to talk about the current crisis with airlines. Not just what's going wrong, but also how to fix it. Okay, so we're all aware of the problems this summer with travel, cancellations, bad service, lost bags. If you haven't had a flight canceled, I'm sure someone you know has, or you've seen the news about it. And the crisis is real. So complaints to the Department of Transportation are up 321% from where they were in a similar period in 2019. Now, I want to go into why the industry is in trouble. And while it looks like it's just kind of a temporary thing this summer, it isn't. It's been a disaster for years, and the roots of it go back decades. So I want to ask and answer a couple of questions. Why are airlines unable to deliver reliable service? Who is regulating them in the government? And I want to go over the actions of the current Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, but also delve a bit deeper into why the airline industry is structurally designed to go into crisis and what to do about it. Okay, so let's start with what happened this summer. Here it is in a headline. Okay, it's bad, unprecedented, and here's how the airlines actually explain the problem. Weather and a staff shortage. Now, the airlines aren't lying. There are weather problems and there are staff shortages, but airlines are being deceptive. There are always weather problems and staff needs. Why did things get so bad this year when they weren't as bad as they were in previous years? So here's what happened. In 2020, when airlines got a $54 billion bailout from the federal government during COVID, they promised to maintain staff. That was the point of the bailout. They had to maintain the capacity that they had. Then at the depths of the pandemic, airlines encouraged their employees to take early retirement. It wasn't a crazy notion. I mean, it was sort of bad faith, but flying planes when it's entirely empty and imagining that it's going to take years before airline demand rebounds, I mean, that was something that almost everybody believed. But the thing is, demand came back much more quickly than anyone expected. So airlines have been understaffed for this resurgent demand. Okay, that sort of explains some things, but not everything. Airlines schedule their flights 11 months in advance, so they know when they can or can't staff flights. But they scheduled flights anyway that they couldn't staff because they wanted to get customer money. And that led to a huge number of cancellations. What airlines are doing is trying to maximize the amount of seats they can sell. So they are assuming, as they didn't used to assume, that everything will go perfectly on schedule with no reserves. They have nothing in reserve to account for bad weather, pilots being sick, delays, mechanical problems. And when things go perfectly, they capture large amounts of revenue. But when anything goes wrong, anything at all, and stuff always goes wrong, that's just life, airlines have to cancel flights. Now, normally, this kind of behavior, mistreating customers, would anger the people who pay you money, the customers, and then they could choose a different firm. Like if you don't like someone's ice cream, you get sick or whatever, you'll buy a different firm's ice cream. But that doesn't happen in the airline industry because these days, customers really have very few choices. After dozens of mergers over the last 20 years or so, there are only a few airlines left. United, Delta, and American Airlines are the three what are called trunk airlines in the US, and if you add in Southwest, those four airlines control most of the market, 80% or so. And it's worse if you look at individual routes. So, in a lot of routes, there's really only one choice or maybe two. Now, there hasn't been a new entrant into the airline industry for more than 10 years. It's actually the largest stretch of time without a new entrant. There were a couple of small ones last year, but essentially, this is the longest stretch of not having a new entrant into the airline industry ever, like since back in the 1920s. So if you're unhappy with service, you really have very few choices. And that's especially true if you're flying out of a regional city. This isn't as bad if you live like I do in DC or in New York or some sort of popular city, which I'll get into, a big city. I'm going to get into that in a second. But it's especially bad for people who don't live in near centers of power. Now, another reason that airlines are overscheduling and canceling flights is because they don't always have to return money for canceled flights. Now, it's actually illegal to not give you your money back on a canceled flight, but during COVID, airlines mostly domestic ones, the big trunk ones, refuse to offer refunds, of between, in aggregate, $5 and $10 billion. They'll often do things like they'll try to give you vouchers or they'll try to give you miles or something like that. They actually owe you cash, but they try not to refund you for something that they didn't deliver. And the problem is that the regulator in charge, the Department of Transportation, did very little about it. Now, in June, the situation with cancellations and refusal to engage in refunds got so bad that Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, and this is the guy with regulatory power over the industry, had to actually explain himself. And here's what he told Fox the other day.
Here's what we're doing about it. We'll collaborate with airlines when they're ready to take steps that are positive and proactive, whether that's improvements in pay that are helping with hiring or flexibility in customer service. We're also going to enforce passenger and consumer rights. And this is not new for us. Matter of fact, it was last year that I announced the stiffest fines ever imposed under our consumer protection program for airlines that were failing to provide refunds to passengers after they got stuck with cancellations. Matter of fact, we have just concluded another 10 investigations on airlines on these issues and have launched another 10 or so that we're going to pursue to make sure that consumers and passengers are protected.
Okay, so that all sounds really reasonable. And there are some indications that airlines, after just a complete disaster over the last couple of months, are just paying lots and lots and lots of overtime. Although there will probably be an elevated level of cancellations for the rest of the summer, it's still a total mess. But you look at the regulator, Pete Buttigieg, he sounds like, he's doing a reasonable job with what tools they have. I mean, a record fine, and investigations, like he sounds tough, but also wants to collaborate. The problem is that there is a lot of, to put it politely, sort of disingenuous rhetoric that he's offering to the public. And it kind of makes me mad when a regulator deceives the public. And that is what I think, unfortunately, Secretary Buttigieg is doing here. So let's go through what the secretary said. So Buttigieg says that the regulators issued a record fine against multiple airlines for refusing to refund tickets. Well, there was only one fine that I could find for not offering refunds. So that right there is a bit misleading. Not multiple, just one. But okay, maybe he just misspoke a little bit. Not a big deal. But let's go to the record fine, which is true, but also misleading. So he's pointing to this penalty of $25 million against Air Canada. Now, the fine got a lot of headlines when it was announced in June of 2021, and it sounds like a big number. $25 million is a lot of money. But the thing is after negotiations between Secretary Buttigieg and the company, or the Department of Transportation and the company, the fine ended up being just $4.5 million. And then $2.5 million of that was just credited to Air Canada for refunds they had given to passengers. So in terms of cash that the DOT says that Air Canada needed to pay, it was just $2 million. And we don't even know if they've paid it. And the number is so small that Air Canada didn't even have to report it to investors as a material event. It was just irrelevant to their financial outcomes. Also, the company didn't even have to admit wrongdoing, right? So they didn't even say, we did something wrong, we didn't refund passengers. The only reason, in fact, that the Department of Transportation cracked down on Air Canada is because the airline simply announced that it would not follow the law and refund passengers. It said, no, we're not going to follow the law. And that is kind of like a middle finger to the regulators. That's the only fine by DOT from refunds due to COVID, is when an airline just openly announced that they are just not going to follow the law. Now, a lot of the others didn't follow the law either. They just didn't say it outright, and so they're fine. So Secretary Buttigieg also says that the Department of Transportation has concluded 10 investigations. That sounds really impressive. But the thing is, it's been 2.5 years since airlines canceled flights without refunds during COVID. Where are the results? Why does it take 2.5 years to investigate and get refunds? And where are the results? Where are the refunds? In fact, 62% of complaints are for domestic carriers, the big guys, the Uniteds, the Deltas, the American Air. And Buttigieg hasn't issued a single enforcement order against a domestic trunk line this year. More broadly, and over time, enforcement has gotten worse. So here's a chart of fines, of enforcement orders by the Department of Transportation. And what you can see is that enforcement against airlines has collapsed. During the Bush and Obama administrations, the DOT issued dozens of orders a year. It was still fairly weak, but there were dozens of them. Trump's Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao, in 2020, her final year, issued just 6 aviation enforcement orders. This goes up to 2019, that chart, but it got worse in 2020 to 6. How many did Secretary Buttigieg issue in 2021? I mean, this is a bad year for airlines. He issued just 4. And this year, with record cancellations and just a total mess at the airports, he's issued 3. So Secretary Buttigieg is just not regulating the industry, and it shows. In fact, 6 years ago, Congress passed a law saying, and this is like really, really easy kind of regulation, right? They passed a law saying that regulators should force the airlines to let children, even very young children, babies almost, sit with their parents without charging those parents a fee. Right? You get to sit with your family if you are a young child. Elaine Chao didn't promulgate the rules. She should have. Congress said you should do this, didn't. Last Friday, Buttigieg said that he would encourage the airlines to seat families together voluntarily without charging a fee. But of course, we know that means it's not going to happen, because if there's one thing that you know about airlines, it's that airlines love fees. Now, okay, so we have a consumer protection regime and a regulator that won't enforce it. And the DOT is the only regulator that has authority to actually enforce consumer protection laws against airlines. Well, so one obvious solution is to take power out of the hands of the Department of Transportation and Secretary Buttigieg and let airline customers and state officials themselves sue the airlines for violating consumer protection rules. There's a lot of state attorney generals, Phil Weiser in Colorado, for example, that would do that. New York passed a Bill of Rights for airline passengers. That was, the court said, DOT is the only one that actually gets to regulate the airlines, not the states. So just change the rule to let other people actually regulate the airlines. But that would help. It would go a long way. But it wouldn't address part of the structural problem, because Secretary Buttigieg, to be fair to him, didn't cause the crisis in airlines. The problem is fundamental. And here's what I mean. Okay, so airlines offer bad service, and since roughly 2011 or so, higher and higher prices. But they've also been increasingly cutting off routes to smaller cities like Olympia, Washington, Salem, Oregon, even mid-sized cities like Pittsburgh and St. Louis. It's not even a terrifically profitable industry. It's been very profitable, this year and 2019 or so. But structurally, it tends to go into bankruptcies or into losses. It swings. It's a very swingy industry. Delta's profit margins this quarter were lower than they were in the same quarter in 2019, and that's with incredible demand and pricing power. So it's weird. You got this industry that's very monopolistic and charges high prices and bad service, but it's also not profitable. And to understand why, we have to go back to changes in the industry that were put forward in the 1970s. So at the time, right, from the beginning of really commercial aviation in the 1930s, when it started in the 1920s, it really got regulated in the 1930s, a government agency called the Civil Aeronautics Board just regulated the industry and set routes and prices. If an airline wanted to fly a profitable route from, say, New York to Los Angeles, then it also had to fly a less profitable route from, say, Tampa to Denver. This was a method of ensuring that there was cross-subsidization, and there were a lot of subsidies as well. But the basic goal was to make sure that Americans, no matter where they were, had roughly equal access to air transportation. We saw the airlines as a national resource, and we regulated them that way. Now, the reason that you have to have these kind of cross-subsidies has to do with the economics and the physics of flight, and this broadly applies to most transportation industries like shipping and railroads and whatnot. Okay, so for flight, it's costliest to take off and land. That's when you use a lot of the fuel. So airlines prefer to fly longer routes over shorter ones, because once you get up in the air, you don't use that much fuel. Also, it's cheaper to serve a busy airport than an empty one, because you can use the same equipment and the cost is spread across more flights. So everyone in the industry naturally wants to serve long flights, because that's what the physics of flight dictate. And they want to do it between big cities, because that's, there's economies of scale in using airports and spreading a lot of flights over in airports. over a busy airport rather than a not busy one. They don't want to do short-haul flights, and they don't want to fly to smaller or regional cities. And the result is, absent any public regulation, anyone saying, here's where you guys gotta fly, there's a collective action problem. Airlines will just cut flights to smaller cities, and they'll all pile into the popular routes. And if a bunch of airlines are all trying to compete on, say, the New York to LA route, every airline will be willing to cut prices to nearly nothing simply to capture an additional customer, since the plane is already budgeted to fly the route, and an additional marginal customer doesn't really cost anything. But the net effect of this is, if everybody is trying to pile into to the most popular routes, is that the industry becomes structurally unprofitable. Airlines go bankrupt, and then there's consolidation. And this is because you have a collective action problem. There's no one saying, you take that route, we'll take this route, and we'll make sure that the industry can cover its cost of capital. So that was what the CAB was designed to prevent. It said, we're going to make sure that we have an air grid that lets people from all over the country get access on roughly equal terms. We're going to make sure that short-haul flights are not way more expensive than long-haul flights, and we're going to make sure that regional cities get some air capacity as well as popular cities. And we're also going to make sure that the airline industry doesn't go into these boom and bust cycles by regulating prices. And there were a lot of problems with it too, but that's basically what it did, and it worked. Okay, so when we deregulated airlines in 1978, and there were some good reasons to do that. Their technology had changed. The old regulatory model was kind of outdated. But when we just got rid of all the public rules and let airlines charge whatever they wanted and fly wherever they wanted, what happened is exactly the ruinous competition scenario that I outlined earlier. Service to small cities ended. They just stopped flying to a bunch of places. And trunk routes went way down in price to consumers. So, LA to New York dropped a lot in price. And so people thought, oh, well, especially in powerful, people in powerful areas, right? The DC, New York, LA, they were like, oh, this is great because prices went way down. But in the rest of the country, it was a different story. A lot of places lost routes, and a lot of cities are having trouble economically because it's just really hard to get there. Also, the Department of Transportation saw promoting the financial health of airlines as its charter. So it didn't really protect consumers for fear of harming the airlines financially. And that's one of the reasons that Secretary Buttigieg, though he's not being particularly assertive, no Secretary of Treasury has been particularly assertive against the industry since 1978, because the DOT wants the airlines to be financially healthy. And they feel like if you force the airlines to treat consumers well, then it will harm their financial health and lead to more bankruptcies. So there's a structural problem there. Okay, so DOT didn't really protect consumers. You had this, lots of expansion into trunk routes, killing of smaller routes. Then came waves of bankruptcies because they were charging fares that were too low, and then consolidation. And that led to price regulation. But this time, it was private price regulation through monopoly, right? So you have an oligopolistic industry, don't have new entrants, and it's the CEOs of Delta and American Air and United and Southwest that are determining which cities get access to the air grid and which ones don't. And they're also determining the terms and services by which people have to pay. And above them is Wall Street, and Wall Street will punish airlines that don't charge baggage fees or that are not engaged in certain forms of withholding capacity from the market. So there is a regulatory scheme. It's just a regulatory scheme that doesn't treat customers particularly well, and that ends up hindering the ability of lots of communities all over the country to get access to the air grid. And this is a foolish way to run a national resource. And fundamentally, that is what airlines are. That is what our airline industry has always been. It's been taxpayer subsidized since the very beginning, whether through mail contracts in the early days, through public money used to build airports, through defense R&D to improve civilian aeronautics, or through direct subsidies after 9/11 and in 2020 during COVID. And it is a good choice to subsidize this industry. we've decided that we want a national air system because being able to fly places is great. And it requires a lot of public infrastructure and rules to make that happen. It's a good thing that we have an air travel system. But these days, we do not regulate airlines as the national resource that they are unless there's a crisis. Then ex post facto, we'll dump a bunch of money in and put some maybe terms on the airlines, which they don't really have to adhere to, because then they're like, oh, we're actually private. We're private companies. We have no public obligations. If it's not a crisis, we sort of let the system flounder. That's what we've been doing since 1978. So we can blame airline CEOs if we want, and they deserve a lot of blame. We can blame poor regulators, and that's a fair thing to do. But the reality is that the problem of a dysfunctional airline system is going to continue until we set public rules in place on where airlines need to fly and what they can charge. And it doesn't have to be the same thing as it was in the 1970s and before. We can do it differently. We have lots of new, great technology. We can have more competitive dynamics. But ultimately, the fundamentals of the system, the physics of flight and the economics of regional inequality that an unregulated or a system regulated by private actors brings to bear, it's going to do bad things until we solve the collective action problem through our government. Now, you may not trust the government. I don't trust the government. And this is for good reason. But the problem is we don't really have an alternative. Because either we govern through our public institutions, or airline CEOs and Wall Street will keep doing so, and they won't do a particularly good job of it. There are lots of people whose flights have been canceled that can attest to that. Thanks for watching this big breakdown on the Breaking Points channel. If you'd like to know more about big business and how our economy really works, you can sign up below for my Market Power Focused newsletter, Big, in the description. Also, why don't you put in the comments, your experiences with flying this summer? I read the comments, and I love hearing your feedback, good or bad. So go ahead and do that. And it's been really fun to talk to you guys and learn with you. But if you want to know more, sign up for my newsletter. It's also in the description. And have a good one.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.